In the Biden administration, we couldn't get a meeting with people at the White House. Now we're welcomed into the White House, and that's just a massive change. I think we want this industry to thrive in the United States. We don't want to push it off.
He laid it out flat. In the Biden administration, we couldn't get a meeting in the White House. Now we're welcome in the White House. That's not lip service. That's a shift. And it tracks directly with his claim that XRP is headed not just into ETFs and funds, but into the U.S. government's digital asset stockpile. The question now, what happens when XRP goes from fringe crypto token to institutional reserve asset? In this video, we're going to walk through what Garlinghouse actually said in the Bloomberg interview and why it matters, the broader regulatory and political backdrop, from the White House to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission to crypto policy shifts, what it could mean for XRP, ETF possibilities, reserve inclusion, institutional adoption, what this doesn't guarantee, the risks, the obstacles, the so what's next scenarios. So strap in, because this isn't just theory. If the narrative is right, this could be one of the quietest major moves in crypto you'll ever see. Let's zoom in on that phrase again. We're welcome in the White House. Why does that one sentence punch so hard? Because for years the narrative around crypto, especially from the U.S. regulatory side, was one of skepticism, wariness, even antagonism. But here's the difference. Garlinghouse isn't saying we have better lobbying or we filed more paperwork. He's saying the room changed, the venue changed, and when the venue changes, what follows often changes faster than regulators can write policy. So what did he literally say? In the Bloomberg interview, he claimed that XRP is in the running to be included in the U.S. government's crypto stockpile, the one that's being built out alongside the strategic Bitcoin reserve. Then he added that a spot XRP ETF is not some far-off possibility, but something he sees as a near-term reality. I have immense confidence in the ETF. Combine those two claims and you get this narrative. The token goes from being just a trading asset to being recognized by the highest institutional echelons, government reserves, regulated investment vehicles. That's a shift in role, not just price. And here's where we stay sharp. Garlinghouse's words are assertions. They're claims from a CEO with a vested interest. They're not official government policy declarations. Not yet. Which means our job is parse what is said, contrast with what is proved, and map out the scenarios where this claim becomes reality or doesn't. First, what exactly is that digital asset stockpile he referenced? In March 2025, an executive order established a strategic Bitcoin reserve, along with a U.S. digital asset stockpile for other cryptocurrencies. The idea: the U.S. government holds certain digital assets, much like it holds gold or oil reserves or seized assets, to bolster its financial leverage or strategic posture. So when Garlinghouse says XRP will be in that stockpile, what he's claiming is that XRP will be treated at least partly like a strategic asset by the U.S. government. That's not trivial. It moves the narrative from crypto as speculative into crypto as infrastructure. And when he says ETF, that opens the door to regulated institutional flows, pension funds, insurance companies, large-scale capital. That's not hype. That's chain reaction. Key takeaways from this section. His public statements are bold: inclusion in stockpile plus ETF. The venue shift, welcome in the White House, signals political/regulatory change. These are claims, not confirmations. So we track probable versus possible versus speculative. In the next section, we'll lay out the regulatory and political landscape that makes these claims plausible, and also what obstacles lie ahead. You can't talk about Brad Garlinghouse's statement, "We're now welcome in the White House," without understanding what that actually means in the regulatory world. Because let's be honest, Washington doesn't just welcome crypto overnight. It took years of lawsuits, political pushback, and corporate diplomacy to reach this point. For context, the United States has always had a split personality when it comes to crypto regulation. On one side, you have the SEC, obsessed with labeling everything a security, led by Gary Gensler, who made XRP his prime target. On the other, the CFTC, treating crypto like a commodity and calling for innovation instead of restriction. That turf war, between two regulators that can't even agree on who's in charge, has defined the last 5 years of crypto policy. And during the last administration, Ripple couldn't even get a meeting inside the White House. Now suddenly that door is open. That single change, access, means the conversation has shifted from, should we regulate, to, how do we integrate? That's the difference between crypto being an outsider and crypto becoming part of national infrastructure. Enter the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve and the U.S. Digital Asset Stockpile. Here's where things get serious. In early 2025, an executive order quietly formalized the creation of a Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, along with a U.S. Digital Asset Stockpile. Think of it as America's digital version of Fort Knox, but instead of gold bars, it's cryptographic reserves. The goal? To ensure the United States doesn't fall behind in the digital currency arms race against China, Russia, and the BRICS nations, who are already stacking crypto and tokenized commodities on their balance sheets. Now, imagine this XRP, the same asset once labeled a security, being added to that digital stockpile. That's not just vindication, that's transformation. Because inclusion in that reserve would position XRP alongside Bitcoin as a strategic digital asset, not just a speculative coin. It would also signal to Wall Street that the U.S. government sees long-term value in blockchain infrastructure, specifically the kind that Ripple provides through its payment rails and liquidity network. What it means if XRP is included. If XRP does enter the government's digital asset stockpile, it would be a first in U.S. history, a non-proof-of-work token recognized as part of national reserves. That alone would rewrite the perception of what qualifies as sound digital collateral. It would mean government agencies, treasury systems, and possibly even the Federal Reserve acknowledge that XRP has utility, not just price action. Precedent? Practically none. But if it happens, it opens a floodgate. Tokens with actual use case infrastructure could follow, Stellar's XLM, Hedera's HBAR, Quant's QNT, assets that operate in real financial pipelines, not just decentralized speculation. This is what Garlinghouse meant by saying XRP isn't just another token. It's positioned for global financial integration. The ETF landscape, why it's closer than people think. Let's talk ETFs, because this is where the institutional money comes in. Bitcoin broke the barrier. Ethereum followed. And Garlinghouse believes XRP is next in line. But getting a spot XRP ETF approved isn't as simple as flipping a switch. The SEC would need to sign off on market surveillance agreements, custody structures, and clarity that XRP itself isn't a security. Something Ripple fought for in court and largely won in 2023 when Judge Torres ruled secondary sales of XRP were not securities. That ruling was a turning point, not just legally but psychologically. It gave institutional players a reason to look at XRP again, without fearing the regulatory spotlight. Today, Bloomberg analysts estimate that if an XRP ETF is approved, it could pull in billions in its first few weeks, because the infrastructure already exists. Ripple's global banking partnerships, its on-demand liquidity corridors, and XRP's instant settlement speed make it more than a meme coin. It's programmable liquidity. And ETFs, by design, love liquidity. So when Garlinghouse says a spot ETF is inevitable, it's not just optimism. It's the logical next step in the pattern we've already seen with Bitcoin and Ethereum. Why the timing is perfect in 2025. Let's connect the dots. The lawsuits mostly behind Ripple. The market's maturing. The White House has opened its doors. And an executive order now officially recognizes crypto reserves at a national level. That's not coincidence, that's coordination. The timing lines up almost too perfectly. Regulatory clarity is improving, institutions are onboarding, and even central banks are exploring tokenized reserves as part of the BIS initiative. So when Garlinghouse says, "We're now welcome in the White House," it's more than political bragging. It's a signal. It's a green light that the hostility is fading and the groundwork for inclusion, ETF and stockpile alike, is already being laid. But there are still real risks. Now, let's not sugarcoat this. Crypto regulation in the U.S. is still a political battlefield. A new administration or policy shift could reverse progress overnight. The SEC could reopen investigations under a different chair, or Congress could stall crypto legislation again. Even within the industry, there's division. Bitcoin purists argue that only proof-of-work coins deserve to be in any reserve. Others question whether XRP's centralized token distribution disqualifies it from strategic status. And if ETF applications face new delays or scrutiny, the momentum could stall. That's why every investor needs to separate narrative from confirmation. The story sounds incredible, but until filings are approved and government holdings are verified, it's still a developing picture. The bigger picture. Still, zoom out and it's clear. The tide has turned. What was once hostility is now cautious acceptance. What was once a courtroom battle is now a policy conversation inside the White House. And for XRP holders, that shift matters more than any short-term price movement. The next phase of crypto isn't about speculation. It's about integration. And Ripple is sitting right in the middle of that conversation. Let's be real, if XRP actually gets into the US crypto stockpile or an ETF, that's not just bullish news. That's systemic change. Because this isn't about retail anymore. It's about institutional liquidity and national strategy merging into one. When an asset becomes part of a government reserve, it stops being a trade and starts being a tool. For XRP, that means recognition as infrastructure, not speculation. It would validate what Ripple's been building for a decade. A real-time bridge asset for cross-border payments, liquidity management, and tokenized finance. And when that narrative locks in, the floodgates open. ETFs bring legitimacy. Reserves bring permanence. And suddenly, banks, hedge funds, and even sovereign wealth funds can hold XRP not as crypto, but as collateral. We saw it with Bitcoin. Once ETFs landed, inflows topped billions. Now imagine that level of capital hitting an asset built for utility, not just scarcity. This is the difference between hype-driven rallies and utility-driven growth. Because when institutions adopt something for function, the value sticks, it compounds. And if XRP gets that ETF approval or that government backing, that's when retail finally realizes. The quiet coin they ignored was being institutionalized behind the scenes. Now, before everyone calls this the XRP era, let's check the fine print. Brad Garlinghouse made bold claims, but they're still claims. The US hasn't officially announced XRP as part of its crypto reserve. No ETF filings have yet cleared SEC approval. And political tides can shift faster than the markets themselves. We've seen this movie before. Progress one year, pushback the next. All it takes is a change in leadership or a single policy reversal, and the same doors that opened could slam shut again. Plus, XRP isn't Bitcoin, and that's both its strength and its vulnerability. Bitcoin thrives on decentralization. XRP thrives on utility. That means it's tied to Ripple's network, legal clarity, and global regulatory alignment. All moving pieces that can be disrupted. So yes, the opportunity is massive, but only if the narrative turns into law, and law turns into integration. Keep that balance in mind. Hype creates attention, but regulation creates adoption. So where does that leave you, the retail investor, the builder, or the long-term holder? First, it's not about chasing announcements, it's about tracking confirmations. Watch for ETF filings, reserve disclosures, or treasury language that mentions XRP by name. That's when narrative becomes tangible. Second, think utility, not hype. XRP's strength is in being used, not just traded. When institutional corridors expand, that's your real signal: liquidity, partnerships, and volume growth. And third, position smartly. If you believe in the narrative, hold responsibly. If you're skeptical, observe strategically. Either way, don't ignore what's happening, because access to the White House doesn't come by accident. The fact that Ripple went from not allowed in the room to welcomed in the White House is a seismic shift in itself. Whether or not XRP makes it into the US stockpile or the ETF list, the message is clear. The establishment is finally taking Ripple seriously. That's the story beneath the headlines, the one most people will realize too late. If you found this breakdown insightful, make sure you subscribe to Be Crypto Smart, because we go beyond news and into narrative power. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next update, where we'll uncover how Ripple's next moves could reshape not just XRP, but the entire digital financial system.
Offshore, where you have fewer regulations.
I think the reason I keep